Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming back fairly promptly after that break so we can start our second session. Do remember to switch your mobile phones to silent mode if you could, please, as we continue our discussion on the GCC, looking at the region and beyond. This session is part of the building blocks theme that we have today, and it's looking at a global refocus on models of regional cooperation. Now, it occurred to me that cooperation always takes diplomacy, and certain people are naturally diplomatic, and a person I always thought of as very diplomatic when I interviewed him was Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa. Although I heard recently a story where he was not that diplomatic, and I'm sure it cost him. Around the time of his 50th wedding anniversary, Archbishop Tutu was being interviewed, and the interviewer said to him, "Archbishop Tutu, you've been married 50 years. That's a long time. In all those years, did you ever contemplate divorce?" And apparently, Desmond Tutu said, "Divorce? Never. But murder," which I think his long-suffering wife probably gave him an earful for. As I mentioned at the start of the day, we are avoiding any speeches in order to make this session as dynamic and interesting and interactive as possible, and the panel will be essentially taking Q&A. I do have a little bit of a briefing from Mr. Malik Dahlan I'll introduce in just a moment, but essentially I want you again to get involved with your questions. We saw how many hands went up earlier, so I will again try to get as many questions in as possible. But please let me introduce the panel. To my immediate right, Mr. Malik Dahlan is the principal and chief lawyer of the law firm and think tank Institution Quraysh for Law and Policy, known as IQ. It's a key advisor on cross-border transactions throughout the Middle East, and Mr. Dahlan has extensive experience in this field. Next to him, Mr. Abdulaziz, Dr. Abdulaziz Sagar is the chairman and founder of the Gulf Research Center, as well as president of the Sagar Group holding company here in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Dr. Sagar specializes in Gulf strategic issues. Next to him, Ambassador Muhamad Noor Yacob is the executive director of the APEC Secretariat based in Singapore, which is a coordinating, technical and advisory body that supports sustainable economic growth and prosperity in the Asia-Pacific region. Ambassador Noor has also extensive experience at the World Trade Organization. Next to him, Ambassador Vanu Gopala Menon is Deputy Secretary for Asia-Pacific at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Singapore, prior to which he was at the United Nations in both New York and Geneva, and also at the WTO. And Mr. John Bruton is the former EU ambassador to the US, also was Irish Prime Minister from 1994 to 1997, during which time he oversaw the transformation of Ireland's economy into that fast-growing Celtic tiger. So I'm very honored to have you gentlemen on board the panel. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Mr. Malik Dahlan to start off with the sort of briefing that you were going to give us on the background, please, sir.
Assalamu alaikum. Wassalatu wassalamu ala nabiyyina rasulillah walhamdulillah. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll be speaking in English, so I hope this is not to the discontent of some. Just allow me a minute to figure out the clicker. We look at regional organization in the Middle East, and we'll realize that there's been a serious backwards dilapidation in that scheme. I would like to just point to this brief remark that came from a book called Kingmakers. The Middle East itself was a name coined by Alfred Trier Mahan, who's an American naval officer. So focusing on that region from a Western perspective, obviously the strategic needs have been the target of many, starting from Napoleon to Hitler to Alexander and Caesar. The military significance is obviously now more echoed these days than ever before. We do have certain realities and issues that we must face, including how this region is being lagging behind, the domestic efforts in terms of reform and liberalization, and the political challenges that we face. The approaches are many, but three, especially in this region: unilateral, regional, as well as global. The political economic challenges as well also lead the Arab world to economic stagnation, unemployment, and political and social unrest. The Arab Spring, which I like to think of as an era of determining 100 years of the need for Arab self-determination, has come upon us. And beyond these political transformations, there is, one can argue, an opportunity or an obstacle before us. I note that the previous session mentioned the rule of law, which I believe that is an important issue for us to keep in mind always, because these political economic openings always lead to the cyclical importance of the rule of law. Let me brief you very quickly, knowing that there are external interests in the region that continue. But this is a bit of history of Middle East regionalism, starting with the Ottoman Empire, which was the greatest sort of example of regional union. Al-Kawakibi, a famous Islamic scholar, started with his book al-Qura in 1899. As-Sanhuri, the father of Arab laws, started with his famous thesis on jurisprudence and the development of the Caliphate towards a League of Eastern Nations. The founder of our kingdom, King Abdulaziz, started with an Islamic World Conference, today the Organization of Islamic Conference, to determine the future of Hijaz. And obviously, Saudi Arabia is the greatest example of a union of various nations in the Arab world today. We look at the treaty organizing trade among Arab League states, all the way to the Common Market Agreement in 1957, the 1964 agreement establishing Arab Common Market, different arrangements by different countries such as Kuwait, the Kuwait Fund for Arab and Economic Development. There were sub-regional efforts, including the revitalization of the Council of Arab Economic Union, but more specifically the Gulf Cooperation Council, the Arab Cooperation Council that was led by Iraq, North Yemen, and Egypt, the Maghreb Union, which started its talks in the 50s and finally established itself in the 60s. And then finally, in 1997, the Council of Arab Economic Unity, because of the requirements of the WTO, added to the addendum, a protocol for Greater Arab Free Trade Area, GAFTA. We do also have the external efforts that started by President Bush in 2004 for a Greater Middle East Initiative, and also the Union of the Mediterranean, which was used by President Sarkozy in his efforts in the region, and also presidency. The international trading system has imposed certain realities on the region, starting with Article 24 of the WTO agreement, requiring or allowing for some regional blocs to prosper. And again, this is the protocol that was added very quickly to that. In 2012, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia had its first trade policy review after 6 years of the accession. I have to admit that Minister Al-Rabi'a, despite his new position, did an incredible job between the 25th and 27th of January of this year in defending the Saudis' position. However, our trading policies still need a lot of work. He covered the GCC and GAFTA, but that is still missing. In the international trading system scheme, you do have some missing opportunities, and I'm sure Ambassador Menon will mention to us a little bit about the Singapore issues, which were driven by the needs of the country, as well as some focus on developing countries under the Doha Treaty or the Doha Development Agenda that you all may know. More recent events is, Allah yarhamu, the Colonel Gaddafi during the Arab neighboring state policy, and in August 2010 we had the Turkish attempt in the Levant. The reality is according, and this is a quote from Prince Salman, the newly appointed Minister of Defense, the GCC is the only successful organization, unfortunately. Let me talk for a few minutes about these models and blocks and the confusion that we have. There are 2 points that we need to remember and have always been a problem between the journey and the destination of these regional attempts, and the difference between interdependence and cooperation. The first serious confusion in conception is that the conception of a market reflects various economic flows of supply and demand. So a free trade area does not equate a creation of a common market. And a free trade area is not a preliminary stage, is only a preliminary stage, it's not the end. The value of these blocks is that it helps nations to build their own economies. The other value is that it's a little bit restrictive in how much sovereignty each state gives up, which is a difficult issue for us to look at. But the goals of membership have to be seen in the future value chain. The second issue is that the final architecture of what is needed for a regional bloc or an establishment was never really considered in the Arab world. Notice, there were so many attempts, and it's not because of failure or not wanting these attempts. It's the frustration of not being able to achieve a final architecture. So you have the European model, and I'm sure that, the former Prime Minister of Ireland will tell us a little bit more about these attempts, which really focus about regional interdependence and moving from decision-making from the locale to the regional level. And that is a very hard step to achieve. The second point that I would say, and there was also the point about the final architecture being drawn. The second model focuses on finding a regional arrangement that allows for better competitiveness into the global market. The problem is, or the global economy, the problem with that model is that you either end up being inward looking and you don't end up benefiting from this new creation, or the outlook becomes very limited in the sense that you cannot really penetrate these markets. The third system, which is the neo-regionalist system, started in the 90s, adopted mainly in Europe, in Asia, where you have developed and developing countries actually working together. And that model, I would argue, is probably the best of the models out there today. And it allows for unfettered passage of capital and knowledge. This is the meat of the argument today and the main takeaway from the talk. And realistically, these arrangements may act either as a building block or, as Gadish Bahgawati argues, a stumbling block. And we need to keep that in mind. I know that Professor Sagar will talk about the GCC and the expansion and the latest attempts since the post-Jasmine Revolution. There was the initialization of the Common Defense Agreement, the inclusion of GCC monarchies such as Jordan and Morocco, which was let go. And then we also, and this was an internal attempt, and then we have TIPI, which is the Trade Investment and Partnership Initiative, MENA, which is a US-led initiative announced in May 19, 2011. Unfortunately, not much has happened within the context of the G8. We also had a lot of calls for a Middle East Development Bank and an Arab Marshall Plan over the summer and fall. I won't go through this quote, but it shows the sentiments that are coming from the states and the superpowers that are looking at the region at this very important time. It is an environment of a perfect storm. You know, I remember one of the senators making a comment that President Obama, we need, you know, bridges in Baltimore, not Baghdad. So we know that today we need our solutions to be our own. And we need to rethink these announcements, and His Majesty did call in December for 2011 for a more integrated initiative for a union, for a GCC union. Secretary General Zayani in the Riyadh Declaration called for coordination, integration, interdependence among member states, while aiming to achieve greater coherence, unity, strength, and well-being. Those basically mean to achieve greater coherence, unity, strength, and well-being through resilience, security, and innovation. And those three pillars are his policy pillars in the fields of politics, economics, and defense. The questions that we have to pose here are: which of these fields hold the most promise for pragmatic, practical, and deeper integration? Should the GCC pursue such opportunities through a new regional institution or through softer forms of harmonization or individual practices of an informal and timely agenda? Here, there are a lot of talks today by some of the consultants of the GCC Secretariat about a confederacy. So there was a switch right now in the way we view how to reform our GCC, or I would like to call the Arabian Peninsula perspective. These are theories of regionalism that are important: international relations, international law, new functionalist, and again, the European model will tell us about John Monnet and the history of the Steel and Coal Treaty. I won't go into all of these things, but we should consider negotiation theory. If we have 6 decision makers, we have a problem when we need to take quick decisions at this time. I also want to use the last point on mushawarat and muwafakat, which is taken from the ASEAN and also the APEC experience. Mushawarat and muwafakat really reflects consensus. Basically, as the Arab idiom refers, وَكَأَنَّ بِضَاعَتَنَا رُدَّتْ إِلَيْنَا. It refers to shura and the concepts of reaching consensus. The new regional alternative that we need to talk about and think about today, whether it's Asian or European, needs to take into account that there is no one solution if we don't know what's the final destination. There needs to be a new diplomatic conference, variable geometry, working at different levels to achieve different needs. Each nation needs to look at what it needs first. And those goals can be different. Some are economic, some are non-economic, some are institutional. This is the APEC model and the EU model, which we'll hear about later on. And there are differences and there are priorities and there are obviously benefits of different ones. Some are highly flexible, and I think APEC is that flexible model. But it also shows you the experience here with Asia, variable geometry, and I know I have a laser pointer here, which I think I can use. Anyway, it shows you the different levels of regional arrangements. It's quite complex, but it also achieves a lot. ASEAN, APEC, Asia, ASEAN plus China, and so on and so forth. The APEC model is, in my mind, I think, is an important model for a simple reason. The flexibility that it brings, but it also brings the business community, such as yourselves, the role in making decisions within the council. This is what we need today. It's not just about security, it's decisions that are being made by business individuals. I also jokingly asked that to Muhamad to show me his APEC business card, which shows the flexibility of people moving within the APEC regions. That we don't have yet. The GCC is a small area, so that's not enough. Proposing the APEC model, there are 3 points that I want to leave you with. Open regionalism would potentially allow all actors with economic interest in the region to become involved without exclusions of any sort, meaning maybe we need China to be with us, or Russia, depending on our needs. The other point is soft institutionalization. We cannot stop each sector's progress if we cannot achieve consensus. 2 countries may decide on something and they will develop that, and it's all about soft laws, meaning it won't impact the nation if they lack of compliance. The third point that I would talk about is incrementalism. We have to accept that things take time. We need to think about where are we going and the final destination and take steps. This is our basic structure today, which is not enough. It doesn't create the variable geometry that even Pascal Lamy, the Secretary General of the WTO, talked about in his February report. He has accepted that the international trading system is not enough to achieve what nations aspire to. So, I leave you with this question. Is it open or block? Are we building blocks or are we calling for openings? I suggest we look towards Asia, and forgive my bias, and start at the beginning as I did in my talk today. We must fully evaluate the usefulness of current councils and organizations. Perhaps the GCC may be morphed into a fully inclusive regional organization, an Arabian, not just Arab, Arabian Union, or perhaps framework will be developed through works as a building block, a connective tissue between the already existent institutions of the region. Either way, Arabia must lead this effort with a framework of variable geometry within the Islamic world, within the Middle East, with Asia. Most importantly and finally, I would like us to think about the way we have described ourselves and accepted the designation of Middle East. Middle East to whom? Maybe it's time for us to think of ourselves as West Asia as opposed to Middle East to the West. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Malik. Dahlan. Actually, I'm going to kick off with a question to each of the panelists, as I did before I open it up to all of you participating. And perhaps based on what you said there, a single question: what do you feel is the biggest single challenge to improving the regional cooperation that you've been referring to here?
I think it's lack of trajectory, lack of consensus on what is the final architecture, and taking ownership of our own destiny in the region. There still seems we can't get out of the framework of the colonizing powers that determined how the region is shaped today. We look at Singapore, for example. One of its greatest minds was Dr. Goh Kin Swee, who precisely started with the little red dot and focused on how can we have our own determination and self-determination in creating our economic interests in the world. So I do think that the solution has to be internal, and we need to accept that it will take time.
Interesting to see what response we get from participants on this idea of that lack of consensus, also from our panelists. As I call on the first question for Dr. Abdulaziz Al-Sagir, let me get up a map that he has very kindly brought in to show current regional affiliations. So if we can get that map up for Dr. Sagir, and I want to ask you about that. It shows the kind of existing blocks that occur, the groupings around the world in terms of regional trade and cooperation. And then we can do a comparison with what's happening in the Middle East. Okay, so here we have the map in its full glory behind you, sir, showing we have NAFTA, Mercosur, all these various unions here, including the GCC in the middle. Let me ask you, first of all, to put it into perspective, and ask why has there been this kind of stubborn reluctance to improve the cross-border trade in this particular region?
Well, obviously, there are a lot of things that have been put in place. What we see today, a greater achievement in the economic field in the GCC is a result of a 30 years plus of a hard and good working effort. The problem what we are facing today is the gap between people's expectation and the ability of delivery. People have much more higher expectation than what the government have been able to deliver so far to them, because they're part of this global environment. They see many blocks in the world have moved forward ahead. They wanted to see actual implementation, because if you look at, for instance, like the free trade agreement, I mean the custom union, it has not been put into place until today quite smoothly. The agreement is there, the political will first is there, the intention is there, the direction is there. Sometimes lack of capacity, more time required, lack of building, trained officers that can go through a lot of these things. It takes a bit of a time. However, I remain quite optimistic that the GCC was founded because of a political and security reason. It is now the right of its people to continue, and the people are seeing the benefit of such an important bloc. So they are a big drive beyond government to move it forward.
I'm going to expand on those ideas as we go on with this debate. I appreciate that. Thank you, sir. And thank you for that map to give us the perspective there. Ambassador Muhamad Noor Yacob, on this issue, how is APEC addressing the challenges that are occurring in global trade?
Thank you. First of all, can I refer to Dr. Sagir's map again, if you don't mind, if you agree?
You want the map again?
Yes.
Oh, if we could have the map back, please. Let's just put that
Is
map
it possible?
back up there. There we go.
Yeah, if you notice that APEC is not there, and no fault of yours, no fault of yours, it is because APEC is not a formal organization in terms of there's a treaty amongst its members and so on. So in a sense, your map helped me to drive home a point, which is basically that. It is, we don't have a treaty amongst our members. We don't negotiate treaties amongst, and commitments amongst, agreements our members are not binding. We have a goal, which is what we now call the BOGO goals. In 1994, the leaders agreed to establish free trade and investment in the Asia-Pacific region. And all these years we have been working towards that. In 2010, we had a review of the performance of the developed members of APEC, and tariffs have come down substantially. I think when we started, it was about 17%. Now it's about 5.8%. So tariffs have come down. Further to address your question, we have not only, APEC does not only address border issues, which is tariffs and non-tariffs. We also address across the border issues. And I'm specifically referring to the phenomenon what is now called in trade, the globalization of the supply chain. The simplest way to explain that is perhaps if you know, all young people now, or some of us even, we carry the iPhone. There was a study done by the WTO, which shows that the iPhone, the final export is by China, but the value added in China itself is only 7%. The design part, which is is done in California, in Apple's laboratories. The assembly is done somewhere else. The chips manufactured somewhere else. The packaging is probably done in Hong Kong and Singapore. So this is the globalization of the supply chain. And APEC, realizing that, APEC has been working to strengthen the global supply chain, to ease flow of goods amongst countries, so that all of us, members of APEC, can benefit from this phenomenon called the globalization of the supply chain.
Let me expand on that, because that's a very interesting idea and obviously has implications for the GCC. How is APEC doing that? What does it achieve? How is it managing to achieve that smoothing of the flow? What does it do?
Well, first of all, as I said, reducing tariffs is a major action. We have also done actions to facilitate movement of goods. Make regulation simpler, establishing single windows, meaning that a trader can just submit a document at one center. He doesn't have to move from one counter to another, and making the facilities at the ports, easier for business. And we are looking at customs procedures and what have you. And we have had 2 trade facilitation action plans. The recent one we just completed, and through that second trade facilitation action plan, we did a study which shows that we save businesses something like $58 billion over 5 years through our trade facilitation action plan.
Excellent, thank you. And I'm going to expand on some of those issues you raised, Ambassador, because that's given us food for thought when it comes to the GCC. And perhaps I could call on Ambassador Vanu Gopala Menon here and ask about the transformational changes that you might have witnessed across the world that already have had an impact across Southeast Asia and perhaps might be relevant for the GCC too.
Okay, well, thank you.
Put the microphone nearer you, sir. Thank you.
Is it on?
It's on, but just need it a bit nearer you, just for the pointing to you.
Thank you, Riz, for giving me the floor. And let me also thank the Jeddah Chamber of Commerce for inviting me to the Jeddah Economic Forum. Let me just talk briefly about the transformational changes taking place around the globe and what it means for ASEAN and the kind of things ASEAN is doing to adapt to these changes. For the last 200 years, the international system has been shaped and defined by the West. And since the end of the Second World War, this has largely been an American-shaped world. That era is now drawing to a close. When President Obama announced at the G20 summit in September 2009 that the G20 would replace the G8, he was in effect acknowledging the end of the post-World War II era. No one really knows how the G20 will evolve. In any case, America remains the single most important component of the international system. Only the US can lead and manage the transition from one system to another. And no solution to any international issue is yet possible without the participation, or at least the tacit support, of the US. Still, the lesson of the last decade is that the US cannot effectively exercise power alone. It must negotiate coalitions to manage the international economy. The current G20 is by no means the final or only possible configuration, but there is no going back. Asian growth, and specifically the spectacular rise of China, India, and the East Asian economies in general, is the main catalyst of change in today's international system. And these changes are particularly disconcerting to those who have benefited from the status quo of the last 2 centuries. And by that I mean the West. China and some other East Asian countries are regarded as fundamentally challenging the Western historical narrative because East Asian capitalism is able to flourish without Western liberal democracy. But it would also be incorrect to characterize the changes taking place as Asia rising and the West declining. The changes in the distribution of power that are occurring are relative. It is not as if the Western system will be replaced by an Asian system. The Asia that is growing is an Asia that has been profoundly shaped by centuries of contact with the West. Indeed, much of Asia, including my own country, Singapore, owes a debt to the West, which has played a significant role in providing technical assistance and investments that have been crucial to our development. China is the most important example in this regard. What made the old system ultimately unsustainable was China's decision to abandon an unworkable planned economic system, resulting in its spectacular growth and increasing integration with the international system. India too began to shake off the shackles of the license Raj and have plugged itself into the international economy. Their trajectories will not be smooth, but the basic direction has been set, and there's no reason to assume that India and China will fail. Another reason why we should not place much credence on this Asia rising, West declining slogan is that there is an increasing interdependence in today's global economy. The current economic crisis has not yet run its course, and the Asian economies have a strong interest in the recovery of the Western economies. Our trade is very much dependent on the Western economies. Having said that, the transition from one kind of international system to another will not be smooth. Even under the best of circumstances, it will be difficult. Domestic politics will inevitably contaminate calculations. The domestic politics of the US and Europe will be particularly sensitive. China has its own domestic political considerations that will trump international responsibilities. In Asia, this ongoing transition has made the strategic environment more complex. There's a consensus across East Asia that some new regional architecture is needed to preserve stability for growth in East Asia. And given the important growing economic and geopolitical weight of China, the continuing importance of the US, and the growing centrality of US-China relations in international relations, the search for an appropriate Asian architecture or architectures will be a major preoccupation for most countries in East Asia for many decades to come. That is why in Asia, you hear of acronyms like ASEAN, APEC, ARF, ACD, EAS, SEO, and others. These are all attempts to create these regional architectures. No one really knows how these experiments will turn out, but against this shifting and dynamic backdrop, ASEAN has continued to be in the driver's seat of various regional fora, trying to shape them and their direction as much as possible. And these various platforms, such as the ASEAN +3, the ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asian Summit, all complementary and not competing. Each forum plays its own useful role and developed organically in response to an evolving strategic environment in order to address real needs and challenges facing the region. There are some countries who prefer a certain neatness. They would like the EAS to focus on political issues. They would like ARF to focus on something else. But these multiple overlapping structures better reflect the diversity of the region, and they provide more resilience and stability than any artificial neatness or a single overarching structure which could prove brittle. ASEAN's success in influencing the wider architecture and cooperation in the Asia-Pacific stems from its founding principles. From its start in 1967, ASEAN has had an economic rationale to improve the lives of its people and shape their futures through solidarity, collective action, and cooperation. But the grouping also provided a political framework to manage and contain members' differences with one another. And in this regard, ASEAN has been largely successful in preventing and managing open conflict between its members. This is no small feat, given the diversity and complexity of the region. In the post-Cold War era, regional integration and multilateralism became vehicles to secure more markets and further regional economic as well as political interests. Unfortunately, the nascent steps that ASEAN undertook were brought to a halt by the Asian financial crisis of 1997 and 1998. And emerging from this crisis, ASEAN found itself wedged between a re-emerging India and China. And there were three possible scenarios at the time. First, both countries would exert gravitational forces that could pull Southeast Asia apart. Second, these two countries could between them occupy all the political, economic, and diplomatic space and squeeze the oxygen out of Southeast Asia, making us irrelevant. Or third, ASEAN could try to enhance its own integration efforts and hold our own in between these two powers. Faced with these three options, the ASEAN leaders chose integration. Frankly, there was no other choice. Every ASEAN member recognized the need to marry national thinking with regional thinking, or run the risk of becoming irrelevant. This resulted in the ASEAN Charter being adopted in 2007, and the Charter is a significant milestone in the history of ASEAN. It forms the foundation of efforts to make ASEAN a more effective and rules-based organization through initiatives such as formal dispute settlement mechanisms, and to develop ASEAN's integration across three community pillars, covering political, security, economic, and socio-cultural issues. Our objective is to build an ASEAN community by 2015. Let me add a caveat that ASEAN has no ambition of becoming a supranational organization like the EU. Our objective is to build a common identity and develop a set of shared values amongst the diverse populations of the region. Clearly, regional integration is a key priority for ASEAN. In a globalized world, economies cannot exist in isolation. Regions need to be better integrated and connected. To help ASEAN achieve its 2015 targets, we embarked upon an ASEAN connectivity initiative and drawn up a master plan on ASEAN connectivity, which includes specific priority projects that each ASEAN member state will implement in accordance with certain timelines. ASEAN connectivity is meant to integrate ASEAN through enhanced physical, institutional, and people-to-people links. At its heart, ASEAN connectivity is an idea which seeks to leverage on the diversity, vibrancy, and energy in 10 ambitious and forward-looking countries to create a whole which is greater than the sum of its parts. It is about transcending primordial cleavages of race, language, and religion so that ASEAN can stand shoulder to shoulder with far larger individual countries and cooperate in mutually beneficial partnerships that will elevate and prosper all our peoples. This is an ambitious undertaking, but ASEAN cannot risk its future by not striving to achieve it. A connected and integrated ASEAN will not only benefit ASEAN, but also the wider East Asian region. ASEAN is currently working with the dialogue partners and relevant stakeholders, including the private sector, to ensure the effective and timely implementation of the master plan. Aside from connectivity, the core of our integration efforts is in the economic sphere, with the goal of creating an ASEAN economic community as part of the wider ASEAN community. Our objective is to create a single market and production base, making ASEAN more dynamic and competitive. With over 600 million people and a combined GDP of US $1.8 trillion, there is much that ASEAN can offer the world. We have made good progress in this area. ASEAN has signed agreements such as the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement, ASEAN Comprehensive Investment Agreement, and is now in the implementation stage. Moreover, economic integration is not simply within ASEAN, but also between ASEAN and our external partners. ASEAN currently has a network of ASEAN Plus One FTAs with several dialogue partners, including Australia, New Zealand, Japan, China, and the Republic of Korea. To maximize the synergy and benefits of these FTAs, ASEAN is now taking steps to try to merge the Plus One FTAs into an ASEAN Plus Plus FTA. This principle of welcoming and indeed encouraging external regions or countries' interest and investment in ASEAN has been central to ASEAN's development. Under Indonesia's chairmanship last year, ASEAN decided to take a natural next step in its evolution as an integrated community and adopted what they call the Bali Concord 3. This will give a political push for ASEAN to better coordinate positions and responses to international issues of common concern where possible. Let me just conclude by saying it would be remiss of me, especially here in Jeddah, not to mention ASEAN's growing links with the GCC. There's been much progress in ASEAN-GCC relations, with an MOU signed between ASEAN and the GCC Secretariats in 2009 and the adoption of a 2-year plan of action, which highlighted specific areas of cooperation in trade, investments, education, culture, and information. Underlying this is how ASEAN and GCC economies have become increasingly intertwined. Asia's share of total trade with the GCC jumped, ASEAN's share of total trade with the GCC jumped from just 10% in 1980 to 36% in 2009. Going forward, we can expect our regions to depend a lot more on each other for economic growth. ASEAN and the GCC were both born out of strategic necessity. And ASEAN and GCC share many similarities that meet the eye. Both regions enjoy a fair abundance of natural resources. Southeast Asia is blessed with resources such as palm oil, timber, rubber, whilst the Middle East is rich in oil and energy reserves. At the same time, both regions are populated by industrious and entrepreneurial peoples in a thirst for learning and knowledge. There is scope for further engagement. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Although you haven't left me any questions to ask about ASEAN, that's why I'm a bit stuck on that one. I want to bring in Mr. John Bruton here and ask about the European voice, because that's something that's been lacking in the whole debate up to now. And of course, you know, in the previous session we heard about Europe being blamed for a lot and the future of Europe being put into question. And I'd like to get your perspective, because you saw Ireland during your time as Prime Minister rise and get to this sort of Celtic tiger strength. And then, of course, you've seen some lessons learned from that where it's had to slide back down again. So give us the European perspective, sir.
Well, first of all, to look
at
Ireland's case, Ireland has the second highest level of foreign direct investment per capita in the world after Singapore. And the reason we have been able to attract that foreign direct investment, pharmaceuticals, information technology, medical devices and financial services, is because we are a member of the European Union. The European Union membership guarantees a small country like Ireland completely unimpeded access to a market of 500 million people in the European Union. Now, you might ask, why does the European Union operate on a supranational basis, whereas the other organisations that we've just referred to operate intergovernmentally? Why does the European Union have to have majority voting? Why does the European Union have to have a European court that arbitrates in disputes? Why does the European Union have to have in the European Commission a big civil service? The answer to those questions are, firstly, Europe has been the place where most of the worst wars in recent history have started. And by creating this European Union, where we're tied much more closely together than, say, countries are in ASEAN, we have been able to avoid going to war with one another. We've been able to reduce our military expenditures from a very, very high level to a very, very low level. And we've been able to devote the savings to other things. Also, by having something like the European Commission and a European Court, we're able to protect within this 27-member union the rights of smaller countries. The European Union does not operate on the basis that the big countries make the decisions and the small countries follow. Every decision has to be agreed in accordance with existing rules which protect smaller countries by giving them larger voting rights in the votes, both in the European Parliament and in the European Council, than they would be entitled to on a basis of strict population. Now, I'm not suggesting that other countries or other parts of the world should follow the European Union model. We have particular reasons to follow the way we have gone. There was, in the session earlier this morning, some criticism of the European Union's handling of the financial crisis. And I would have to say, I accept that criticism. We did not prepare adequately when we launched the single currency, the euro, in 1999. And we have made mistakes which we are now having to put right. But the underlying cause of the problem in Europe today is not the existence of the euro. The cause of the problem is we are getting old. We are aging as a continent. The dependency ratio is going to get higher as we get older. And that had not been faced up to at all in Europe until the financial crisis. The financial crisis is now forcing Europe to make structural reforms that it needed to make anyway. And I would contend that we're further on than is the United States in making structural reforms. They haven't even started in the United States to reform Medicare, to reform Medicaid, or to reform Social Security, whereas in every European country, because of the financial crisis, we're now being forced to make these reforms. So I hope that we will recover and that we will continue to be a very good market for the Gulf Cooperation Council for the sale of the many valuable products that Gulf Cooperation Council countries have to sell in Europe.
Now, Mr. Bruton, if I could pick up on something Ambassador Menon said, and perhaps you could also respond to this, is this idea that, ASEAN's success was based on a number of factors that you had described, sir. And Mr. Bruton, one of the comments that Ambassador Menon made was that, ASEAN is not a supranational group. Doesn't have that kind of aspiration. Do you feel that perhaps is a fair description of the EU and where it might have gone wrong?
Well, the EU is a supranational organisation. If there is a dispute in the matter of EU rules between the interpretation of the European Court or the interpretation of a national court of that rule, then the decision of the European Court is the one that is adopted. Otherwise, you'd have 27 different applications of the same laws in the European Union. By having a single arbiter, the European Court of Justice, we're able to ensure uniformity. Yes, indeed, we are a supranational organisation in the areas in which the European Union has entered. But there are many areas, such as defence and foreign affairs and culture and education, where the national governments continue to be the ones that make the decisions.
And Ambassador Menon, on this idea, your views on that perhaps ASEAN, how its different model might serve to work better?
I think the circumstances under which ASEAN was created were quite different from the circumstances under which the European Union was created. I think we acknowledge the fact that there are differences, big differences, and a big gulf. I mean, if you ask people in Singapore, policymakers in Singapore, they will say that we aspire one day to be like the European Union. But we know that we are far from it. We have to move inch by inch, foot by foot, to get to where we are today. And we've done quite well. From where we started under inauspicious circumstances in 1967, we've come a long way, and I think we've done quite well. And I think we hope one day to get to where the European Union is, but I don't think we are going to have the kind of supranational organization that they are. But it's worked well. I mean, what we have achieved so far, I think, has worked well for us. I mean, we have to move at a pace that everyone is comfortable with. And let's not forget, ASEAN had to take in countries at a much lower level of economic development. And they had to play catch-up. And I think we're helping them to catch up. And until everybody is sort of more or less on equal terms, it will be difficult to see ourselves going the route of the European Union to become a supranational organization.
I know, Malik Dahlan, you had a comment to add to this. I'm going to open it up for questions.
I guess one of the points that are different about the EU and ASEAN is the history. Obviously, one doesn't want 2 centuries or 3 centuries of warring until you reach a situation to realize the benefit of a union. So that, I think, is an important thing. I do think one of the most important points about ASEAN, which I remember in one of the summits I've attended in Singapore, was a point which I liked, and this is a mistake we end up making here in the Arab world. We talk so much about the commonalities, how it's the same culture, same language, same heritage. But it was a point that was made by the Secretary General there that said, it is precisely when we start focusing on our differences that we make the transition to a union. I don't think we'll reach a stage where it's time for someone to be a superhero. We came out of that from the Caliphate. So to actually reimagine that again is going to be difficult. And I do think the path of Asia bears more similarity, at least from the history. I mean, Myanmar, Cambodia is not too dissimilar with the problems that we had in Libya with the late Colonel Gaddafi. So
I'm going to get some perspectives on this from the panelists and, of course, your comments and questions in a moment. I want to bring up a question that we have for the voting, just hands up again if you have a voting device in front of you, please. You have? Okay, good. Hopefully we'll get enough. If you can see one near you, then reach for it too. But let's get a vote in here. The question is, with this one question we have for this session is, which is the most important reason for establishing regional blocs? Which is the most important reason for establishing regional blocs? Answer A, if you think it's increasing economic growth. Answer B, if you think it's ensuring political stability. C, if you think it's reducing economic uncertainty. Or D, increasing international influence. So those four possible reasons for why it's most important to establish a regional bloc. Increasing economic growth is A, ensuring political stability is B, C is reducing economic uncertainty, and D, increasing international influence. Please do vote, and let's see what we get as a result. This might spur some conversation in the questions too now. Let's see what the outcome is. Just takes a minute to collate all the information. So we should have that. Okay, so 39% of you believe it's increasing economic growth. That's the most important reason for establishing a regional bloc. And then 34%, quite close, say it's ensuring political stability. Only 6% believe it's reducing economic uncertainty, but 21% believe increasing international influence. So there we have a result. Thank you for that. It's good to have your vote on those. Let's see if we can get some hands up for questions, and we'll get the microphones to you. Number one there. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Since we have a composition here, or linkage between the economics and political power and geopolitical structure. By the way, my name is Saeed Al-Ghamdi. Presently we have two emerging powers in Asia, that is India and China. And China is competing. Presently, there are estimates that it is the second economy at the moment, and soon it will be the first economy in the world. Now, with economy comes power. Now, does the panelist think that the emerging of China as a #1 economy will be projected to change the world geopolitical structure? Or will it contain itself to economic power and leave the other power to a part of the equation to United States and Europe? Thank you.
Sir, thank you. I know a couple of our panelists would have an interesting view on this, and perhaps, Dr. Sagar, I could start with you with a Gulf perspective.
China have clearly identified their security dimension with 4 key issues. When you ask the Chinese, what is your biggest concern? They will say rate of exchange, level of growth, protectionism, Pacific security. So if you look at these 4 issues, it has very much linkage to the US. So in reality, the Chinese still today realize that a lot of their security is realized beyond their border, not only within their ability and so on. So will the Chinese being able to change a lot of things? I think it's premature to say. I think still China relies a lot. I mean, if you look at alone the European export about 110 billion to China, but the Chinese still export about $320 billion to Europe. So the European market is quite important. Again, if you look at China in relation to our part of the world, 55% of the Chinese import of energy come from our part of the world. And the Chinese will have a 7% increase annual in that. So saying that, it means the Chinese are not yet ready to play and change the geopolitics of the world, or to become the real power today that can change. They might be down the road, 20 years, 25 years down the road, if the level of growth maintained. Because again, look at when the Chinese are concerned about the level of growth, 62 million housing empty in China, has not been occupied. So there's plenty of domestic issues, plenty of issues have not really been addressed yet in China. So I don't think they're ready yet to move to that change.
Perhaps Ambassador Noor, you have a perspective on this, sir.
I mostly agree with what Dr. Sagar says. China is fast growing. China is at least in PPP terms, second biggest economy in the world. But from what little I know about politics is that if you look at history, China has always been taken more of a defensive stance rather than offensive stance. For example, I visited the Great Wall of China, and if you look at the Great Wall of China, the message gets through really clearly to you that it's for defense rather than for an offensive purpose.
Thank you, sir. Interesting perspective. I'm going to get a question from our ladies section, microphone number 5. Thank you there.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Amal Arab Hashim, Chairwoman of the Political Science Department at King Abdulaziz University. My question, if I may, Dr. Sagar or Mr. Dahlan. The GCC is at times regarded as a confederation, examples of which have evolved into a single federal state. How realistic do you see this happening to the GCC, and if so, any perceived time frame or any measures you know of which have already been initiated by the member states towards that end? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Mr. Malik Dahlan, if I could ask you first, perhaps, to address it.
I'll defer to Dr. Sagar in a bit, but I don't think it's a confederacy under the definition of within sort of nation building or from a constitutional perspective. I know there are attempts right now that are being discussed. There's a consultation process that's taken place. The Secretariat had been derailed right now with the strategic dialogue with Turkey, and there is a nomination process right now from each GCC country to get experts to actually talk about the confederacy approach. Again, I think we do miss deadlines, and Dr. Sagar will emphasize, probably will talk a little bit more about those.
Your valued perspective, sir.
Do you mind if I answer it in
Please.
Arabic? Because I wanted to explain it just for the others.
If you need translation, please take a hold of your headset. Dr. Sagar will answer in Arabic for this one.
دعوة خادم الحرمين الشريفين للوحدة الخليجية في نص الخطاب حينما تقرأ خطابه في الاجتماع القمة ركز على قضايا مهمة جدا، البعد الأمني فيها أساسي جدا. حينما ركز أننا مستهدفين، حينما ركز على أن المنطقة مستهدفة، فهنالك بعد أمني مهم جدا في الدعوة إلى الوحدة. العقوبات اللي تواجه أو العقبات التي تواجه هذه الوحدة هي 4 قضايا أساسية. أولاً، بعض الدول الخليجية ترى أن هنالك بنود كثيرة في التعاون لم تتحقق إلى الآن، فلذلك هم يرون أن تحقيق ما تم الاتفاق عليه أو ما تم إبرامه في المرحلة الأولى قبل الانتقال من التعاون إلى الوحدة. بعض الدول الخليجية أيضاً تخشى من هيمنة الدولة الكبيرة على الدولة الصغيرة، وهذه قضية ثانية مهمة جداً. ولكن أيضاً هنالك نقاط مهمة في هذا الجانب. هنالك تفاوت في اقتصاديات دول الخليج، في دول غنية وكبيرة مثل المملكة، قطر، الإمارات، الكويت، ودول أقل غناء مثل البحرين وعمان مثلا. هنالك أيضا يعني مشكلة أخرى أنه كل الأنظمة في دول الخليج أنظمة عوائل مالكة حاكمة لها علاقة متميزة فيما بين العوائل الحاكمة وشعوبها، فهي عشان تتنازل عن مفهوم السيادة، يعني هذه قضية ثانية تحتاج إلى عمق أكثر في التفكير وإلى وقت. فقضية السيادة قضية مهمة، قضية النظام السياسي والعوائل الحاكمة، العلاقة بين الأسر الحاكمة وشعوبها، التفاوت في الحجم الاقتصادي والقوة، هذا أيضا يخليها هذه كلها أنواع من العقبات اللي يمكن تجاوزها يعني مستقبلا. هنالك حوار بدأ، هنالك لجان شكلت من كل دولة. اليوم الاجتماع الوزاري في الرياض للوزراء الخارجية سوف يناقش ما توصلت إليه اللجنة الاستشارية اللي كان 3 مندوبين من كل دولة لها بيجتمعوا وبيناقشوا هذه القضية. أنا متأكد أنه البوليتيكال ويل أو الإرادة السياسية موجودة والرغبة السياسية موجودة. أيضاً إذا انتقلنا من قضية معالجة العقبات والإشكاليات فلا بد من تسويق هذه الفكرة شعوبياً، بمعنى أن أبناء دول مجلس التعاون الخليجي يشعروا بأهمية هذه الوحدة ورغبتهم تكون أكيدة حتى تنتقل إلى مرحلة التطبيق.
Dr. Sagar, thank you very much. Next is microphone number 3, and then I'm going to ask you to move it forward to the gentleman at the front afterwards, please.
Thank you very much. I think we should define our role in the Gulf before doing anything. the European Union has been soliciting money before in 2008 for Bulgaria and Ukraine and some other countries. And they want the money sucked out from the Gulf to there, where they are a lot more richer than many of us. International Bank Fund came about 2 months ago. They want to create fund 500 billion. Majority will come from the Gulf, as she said, because the money United States refused. Europe said we'll give 200, but the 300 looks like it's supposed to come from the GCC or somewhere else. I think they are putting our role as collector of money from the poor nation or from the new nation who want energy and they pay high price for it. We collect it, then we save for it back to United Nations at extremely ridiculous return on bond, or to give it to the European Union also at ridiculous fund, or they will threaten you by creating war, then you don't have anything to do. Baker, the Minister of Finance and then the Minister of Foreign Affairs, he came on TV on CNN a few months ago, or a few weeks ago. He said without the petrodollar, United States will be worse situation than Greece and Portugal. We have to protect the GCC because we need the petrodollar. Is our role in the GCC, and this is addressed to Dr. Abdulaziz, who is part of this new group, is our now goal is to solicit all the money under the petroleum price, which goes higher and higher, and which could create another substitute and siphon it back to United States or to European Union, who almost they have only the armament to sell to us to fight regional fight.
Let's get an answer from two perspectives. I'll get Dr. Sagar to respond first, and then perhaps John Bruton, you could give us your perspective. Dr. Sagar first.
Well, شكرا على السؤال. I think I'll go back into English now. The GCC money in the US bond is about $2 trillion. Some of it is government, some of it is private sector. But at the same time, I don't think we only sell to the poor nation. Almost more than 65% of our energy supply goes to rich countries like China, Japan, South Korea, and India. Of course, Asia is our biggest market, is where we see the future expansion there. So I don't think we only sell to the poor country, we sell to both. I don't think even we determine the oil prices, because oil prices is being determined by the market and the requirement and the growth and the level of growth on the market there. When the market dropped to $9, we could not change it because that was the market price. When the market went more than to $147, I remember the Saudi Minister of Petroleum, Al-Naimi, said we are happy with $70 to $80. And the Iranians said they need $250. So in reality, we never determined the oil prices. When even the price was at a level of 100, the CEO of Aramco said there's a $30 cushion on the speculators' hands, and so in reality, we don't determine the oil price. It's the market, it's the supply and demand theory that do that one. How important our money for the US Treasury, for the US bond? I think yes, the US is primarily it's our strategic partner. US does not only provide an importance in terms of economic, but don't forget that the security of the region, US is a key player on that dimension, and I think that cannot be neglected. In fact, what the US today import from the region is less than 1.5 million barrels a day. So it's the other destination, it's the other country that, our security relies with the West, but our market goes to the East. This is why King Abdullah used the terminology, we're looking at the East, because this is where our level and our growth in that one. Yes, we need to diversify our income. We need to move only from oil to another products. But at the same time, I think we have not been yet successful in diversifying our economy by getting other resources to our economy. Still, we are in a region where 92% of our budget come from the oil revenue.
Mr. Bruton, I just want to address this idea, and it's a feeling that I hear quite regularly in this part of the world. There is a sense that the heavy hand of the West is on the shoulder of the Middle East in particular. Your response to the gentleman's statements about the fact that the West tends to expect a lot from this region, perhaps unfairly.
Well, I suppose the truth of the matter is that we are in the West a major customer for the principal product of this region, which is oil. And we are very dependent and increasingly dependent on this part of the world for that product. And that makes us anxious because we need to plan for the future, and we don't want to see supplies of an essential product for our survival interrupted in any way. We do also recognize that as a result of the increase in the price of oil, there are surpluses available here that need to be invested both in the short term and in the long term. Clearly, in the long term, it is best for this region that they should be invested here. But in the short term, in order to get a good return in the short term, it may be good for some of those monies to be invested in government bonds and in other assets in places like the European Union, because the European Union countries are an important customer for the product from this part of the world, and unless the customer can afford to pay, the customer will not be buying the product.
I was addressing to some degree the threat aspect, that America comes in and perhaps the EU come in a little heavy-handed, expecting
I don't think that is the case. I think we recognise that the money that has been made from the sale of oil is your money. There's no question but that it is your money, and you're entirely free to invest it where you like. We believe that in some cases you will get a good return by investing it in infrastructure in Europe. But if you feel you can invest it better somewhere else, go ahead and do that. You're free to do it because it's your money.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to get to the questions in the order in which I saw the hands go up. I see you, number one, but number four was next here. Please.
Thank you. My name is Ahmed Badr. I'm Vice Commercial Counsel of Egypt in Jeddah. There are 3 points I want to highlight, very quick points. The map that showed us the regional economic blocks missed to highlight COMESA countries, EAC, and GAFTA. And the second thing is that I don't think the panelists mentioned the issue of that some countries are members in more than economic bloc, or have trade, are members of some trade facilitation agreements, and commitments under these trade facilitation agreements or trade bloc, economic blocs sometimes conflict and contradict with each other. The third thing is that there are things to be learned from EU and ASEAN, but it's important not to copy the model as it is. Each region has its characteristics which should be taken in consideration. If we make a SWOT analysis for each regional bloc, we'll find the elements that come under the strength is different from one region to another. And that comes also for opportunities and threats that face these regional blocs. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, sir. And let me start with the latter part. And perhaps, Ambassador Menon, I could start with you, sir, on this issue of, well, first of all, not needing to copy the models of ASEAN, for example, or even the EU, that, each regional association can be independent. And perhaps also into that, talk about the conflicts that exist in multiple relationships or multiple memberships, where there might be conflicts that have to be addressed.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, your second part about each region having its own peculiar characteristics, I mean, this is a fact. I mean, there's nothing that I can say which will dispute what you just said. I mean, we in ASEAN have our own set of characteristics, our own set of circumstances, historical as well as current, and I think the same would apply to any other part of the world. So I think each region will have to find its own right formula to get its act together, and there's no attempt by ASEAN to suggest that what we have done or done right for ourselves is applicable, let's say, to another part of the world. We are not here to give advice to anyone. We are just here to tell you that this is what we've achieved. There's some things in there for you that you want to copy, please go ahead and do so. If you want to take some of our lessons and modify them to fit your circumstances, please go ahead and do so. But there's no suggestion from ASEAN that what we've done right is applicable to any other part of the world. But we've done some things right. So there must be some things that we've done well which might be lessons for you. And that's where I think I would leave it in terms of regions copying each other. Your first point about trade agreements maybe contradicting one another, I think it might be so in some parts of the world, but I think in our part of the world, we tried always to make sure that whatever we've done in terms of trade agreements is consistent, I think, with what is provided for in the World Trade Organization's agreements. And I think Muhamad Yacob, my colleague on the left, who was formerly General Counsel Chairman of the World Trade Organization, who knows this better than me, will probably confirm that in ASEAN, everything we do is in line with the spirit and charter of the WTO. And I think most agreements that ASEAN has signed have been in that spirit. Of course, I agree with you, there are some trade agreements that have been signed which may not be consistent with the WTO, but we've always aspired to make it WTO equivalent or WTO plus.
Perhaps, Ambassador Noor, you could actually elaborate on this, what Ambassador Menon just said, about this need to be able to balance these structural memberships.
Thank you. A couple of points, if I may say so. I think Brother Dahlan, when he introduced the subject, he mentioned about these so-called trade blocs being formed but recognized under the WTO rules, Article 24 you mentioned. That I think is the core of the matter. You see, world trade is governed by the World Trade Organization, but Article 24 allows some of its member economies to develop particular arrangements between them. They negotiate, and once they negotiate the terms of whether tariffs or non-tariff measures are the result of negotiation between the parties to the regional trade agreement. And you are right that there are so many of these FTAs or free trade agreements, or some people call it RTAs for regional trade agreements, that you recall Jagdish Bhagwati used the term spaghetti bowl, because what has happened is that there are so many rules apply, because each of these free trade agreements are different from each other. And the purists among us consider that to be not to be very efficient in terms of promoting trade. And by the same token as well, because these FTAs are negotiated between two countries or between more than one country, like in ASEAN. Now 9 countries are negotiating the Trans-Pacific Agreement. They are going to be different because they are the result directly of the negotiation between those countries. But one last thing, what APEC has done on our part is we have developed some what we call model measures. So if you have a free trade agreement, this is the sort of thing that you might want to have on tariff. This is what you want to have on non-tariff measures, and what have you. This is trying to encourage uniformity, trying to encourage consistency between FTAs, and therefore going back a step closer to the ideal of a multilateral trading system. But having said that, like Ambassador, my good friend Vanu says, we are not trying to impose this on others. As you know, in APEC, one of the core principles we have is voluntarism. You know, open regionalism. It is up to members to adopt these measures as they see fit.
And perhaps, Dr. Sagar, I don't know if you want to address the issue of a couple of the groupings being missing. I know now you've been pointed out that APEC wasn't there and so on. I don't know if you wanted to address that. There were a couple.
Definitely, like you are right, because this, there was two versions. There was the first and the second, but I think maybe I've covered the first version and not the second one. But I know about the African different part. I mean, Sadiq was there, the East also bloc was there, but that one was not there.
The key being there was no political motive, and that's the important thing.
This is why I was looking at it here. It's here. But not in the
time for just a quick question. I know this gentleman was waiting as well next, so I want to come to microphone 3.
Okay. Well, while the WTO is in the wheelchair now, isn't it time for us, particularly the Middle East or the GCC, where we do not have a huge number of populations, but we have great resources, and as crude oil consumption is decreasing, it makes more responsibility on us to make the best incremental value of the barrel by going further downstream and further industrializing in Saudi Arabia. Do you think that it will be a good vehicle if the GCC works as a catalyst where within themselves they work in a complementary framework rather than competing, because honestly, we are competing with each other.
Okay.
And work with ASEAN, as I see now, China is going beyond borders. China is developing a lot with Turkey and Iran, including a common currency that we don't know what it is. I am afraid that we will be lost in the middle, where we have all of these resources, and it is time for us, as we are exporting 65% of our crude oil east of the Suez Canal. So it means that the integration and the relationship between the Asia-Pacific, and Saudi Arabia or the GCC is becoming more important. And if that happens, that will create a natural political stability to this region, because you are part of that world. There is a model, of Messiana or Messian, that at least does that as a catalyst, to develop this for a further, positive results in the region.
So thank you for that question. Ironically, you're touching on a subject that comes up in the third session where we look at greater GCC integration. But let me get Dr. Saqr to address this just briefly. This idea of perhaps the GCC being left behind unless there is a better model, a better cooperation.
Well, I mean, the GCC understand that, and this is why there's a lot of agreement between the GCC as a region with other parts of the world. Now, of course, there has been some obstacles. The GCC, after the financial crisis, they wanted to revisit about all this FTA agreement, whether it's useful to do it, whether it's not useful. Can we have a better conditionality, a better, negotiating point? I'm sure the study will finish quite soon, and then they will be able to readjust with that one. But I totally agree with you that looking at the East is important. And again, if you look at the market size, 400 million Indian, they don't have access to power. So that, and the former CEO of Aramco said, my biggest buyer in the future will be India. So in reality, we understand that within the GCC, we understand that our export, our future market is more, toward Asia. I would expect to see a much more closer collaboration between the ASEAN and the GCC, of course, on that.
Thank you, sir. Now, of course, I apologize to those of you who didn't get questions in, because we always are so tight for time. It's great that so many people want to ask questions. Remember that the theme continues throughout the day, and many of your questions will be relevant for later as well. So do save those. One quick story I want to share with you in honor of Mr. Bruton and his countrymen and women. A story I was told recently was that, the Irish are very famous for being very direct and being straightforward and no nonsense, and very admirable for that. A story of EU politicians who were doing a tour of Ireland. They were doing a tour of the countryside in a big bus, to look at agricultural issues and so on. And the bus crashed. And this farmer, Irish farmer, happened to be watching on the edge of his land on the road, this big bus go out of control and crash. And he was the first on the scene. And he arrived there and found this complete carnage. By the time the emergency services got to the scene, they found the farmer wiping his brow with his shovel, resting, having been sweating, having dug graves. He'd buried everyone. So the emergency services came and they said, that was terrible. What a terrible crash. It took us a long time to reach this rural location. But, you know, what happened? You've buried them all. They all died? I mean, was there no one alive? He said, yeah, a few of them said they were, but you know how these politicians lie. So don't mess with the Irish farmers. A big round of applause for our panel, please. And we start promptly back at 2:45 for lunch, so please do be prompt to come back. And that third session, again, is following on this theme of GCC integration. Save your questions for that, and we'll try and get to those. Thank you.